That was absolutely amazing. I had so many questions as you were going through your program. It must have been amazing to be upside down like that. What was that? What did that feel like?
Well, in a cockpit, it's fine. Now, when I was flying with my friend in the biplane, I can say I was literally hanging in the harness. The harness goes around you, six-point harness, but I was also gripping on the underside of the seat because what I did find after the first loop or the first barrel roll, you become sort of desensitized to it. But of course, the other thing, and I think I shared with you before, we were flying quite often in the old-fashioned World War I flying suits, and our communication was only on a tube, so no sophisticated electronics. And then the other thing that I wonder now why the heck I did it, but I used to swing the prop to get the plane going, and I think to myself, oh, so easy to slip. And I guess we were so young, we didn't worry about these things. But
that's amazing to think of the advancements that you've seen in aeronautics, through your lifetime.
Well, now, of course, on my virtual reality system, we've got very sophisticated navigational, we've got GPS, but much better systems. So I did take night flying lessons because that was important to be able to fly in different conditions. And I did in Britain, actually. I part of the course, you had to fly in cloud and fly totally on instruments. You had to learn how to trust the instruments because you basically can't trust your sense of balance. You can be upside down and you will not know you're upside down. And so you can very quickly end up in a stall. But I like to feel that I beat the instructor who was kept on throwing really difficult situations. You're under a hood, so you can't see out at all. And they would tell you to keep your eyes closed. Then they would put the plane in some incredibly difficult position. And then they'd say, open your eyes. And of course, you're in the middle of clouds, so you haven't got a clue where you are, but you have to put all your trust in the instruments. And one of the things I like to think, the 60 hours of training I did, the training is so important because when something goes wrong, you immediately flick into a training mode. You start to pause, analyze the situation, particularly, leaving Calgary International a few times and ending up in cloud, where I shouldn't have been because I didn't have the qualification for that, but quickly switching into using the instruments to get me back into something I could understand and help with.
That's amazing. I was thinking too, it must have also been quite difficult to pinpoint the other planes to get that laser shot in.
It was, and I think that showed me how difficult it would be to be a military pilot when you're only chasing one other plane. So yeah, you constantly, and of course I said, where's the rear view mirror? Because you don't have a rear view mirror. And yeah, we had to hunt out that other plane. It was a big expanse of open sky. And we knew that, the 3 times he got me, he came out of nowhere. Now it was very interesting because in the run up afterwards, they show the videos. They're shooting 6 videos in the plane. And so the guy from Vietnam really put me down a few times by saying, you guys that fly sissy Cessnas, you really don't know about flying. And he's right. It's a very different kind of attitude about being a military pilot where you're very aggressive. And yeah, I could do that once a week and be quite happy, but the cost is about $1,200 for that course. But I would highly recommend it to anybody who's ever had a fascination with flying. Very different way of thinking about flying.
Well, I was fascinated too, that shot of you with turning around, right, to look for the plane. And it reminded me of the movies from World War II where they show the flying aces and they show them very dramatically, like looking around and up and down and everywhere. So you can imagine that it would have been, you'd have to be a gymnast in your seat to be able to actually see what's coming at you. And
yeah.
Very
very nice being in a very maneuverable plane and being with an instructor who frankly was quite happy to let me do all the flying. A couple of times I got into the loops and I was, because upside down at the top of the loop, I didn't have enough speed and I dropped out of that loop. You stall basically upside down and go into a spin, but we got out of it okay. You had plenty of height there to do the recovery.
To recover. Yeah, you need that recovery room. Well, I know that my brother used to fly, and it was the same with him, is that he just ran out of money for it. It's just too expensive for the average person to be able to pursue as a hobby.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think one of the nice things about it is it made me realize we've all got different fear levels. You know, we're all, there's something we're all frightened of, and sometimes it's a good thing to try and tackle that fear. And as I say, after my first solo flight, I said I'd never do that again, but it's like a drug. Even the mixing with the big jets at the international, and even going into the old Edmonton Municipal, where quite often I would be on a landing run, and they'd say, "Sorry, you've got to go around again because we've got the CP flight coming in right behind you, and you need to get out of the way really fast."
Wow. And it must be quite a drug if you said that and then 5 days later, or however many days it was, you went up again.
Yeah, as I say, it becomes a drug. And I think I was always a little apprehensive, particularly taking off from the international. Apprehensive once you're on the runway, you're given clearance, and you just think for a few seconds and then push the throttle in and you get going. Okay, well, that's fun talking to you, and it's kind of, I'm going to have to go and get my other system up and go and do a bit of flying.
Absolutely. The virtual reality stuff, that's so cool how realistic that is. I didn't know that it would feel that realistic for you. That's pretty amazing.
It's to a point where you can be at the gate with the plane, have the pushback, and start a jet from total, the first switch you have to turn on. Now, I generally do it where I'm on the runway and the engines are running. So the level of realism is incredible. You can actually, commercial pilots are doing a lot of their training actually using the system I'm using. And a couple of times actually, when I was way back doing research into virtual reality, I actually joined pilots in a proper simulator. You know, using, they were coming back after a few years of rest from flying, and so they had to go through emergency procedures, and the simulator is on 3 pneumatic legs, and it actually pivots around depending on what they want to simulate. You can almost do everything but turn upside down.
Wow.
So I actually, with a friend who sneaked me into this another simulator in Vancouver, I actually flew a jet quite adequately, landed quite well, and with a little bit of help with what you have to do. And the basic, somebody told me early on, the 3 important things about flying are airspeed, airspeed, and airspeed. As long as you've got airspeed, you're flying. The winds are working.
Which is why it's a problem when you're in the top of the loop, because you're losing speed, right?
I completely lost the speed. Yeah.
Right.
So yeah, I mean, that's the big lesson is whenever you hear the stall warning coming on, you know you've got a problem. You've got to take action immediately. So with a jet, of course, your stall speed is about 120 knots as opposed to a Cessna, which is only about 50 knots. So you just got to get used to flying a lot faster. Yeah.
Right, and then of course your reaction time has to be that much faster too.
Yeah, I did actually graduate to a retractable undercarriage, but didn't do very much flying with that. That's when the money started to run out. So,
as this happens, yes. Marika, do you have any questions for Barry before we let him go?
Barry, I was wondering about how flying yourself changed your experience being on a plane, like a commercial airliner. Did it change how you experienced that?
Very much. Jennifer's always saying, I know you're waiting to be called to the cockpit because of an emergency. So we've actually been in 3 emergency situations, and probably the biggest one was coming out of John Wayne Airport, and it's 600 feet. We actually hit one of the engines, hit some ducks that were flying in the area. Immediately the plane dropped, and a lady in front of me was freaking out, and I put my hand on her shoulder and said, "Don't worry, because pilots, they train for this. They love this kind of thing to happen." And so I kept my hand on her shoulder through the whole of the flight down, and I was a little bit nervous, but sure enough, we landed in LA and everything was fine. And so we've had 2 other experiences like that. And in fact, one where I was in the middle seat and there was a lady on the window seat, and she started to grip my arm, literally really gripped it on takeoff. And she said, "I'm really sorry, but I'm terrified of flying." And she said to Jennifer, "Do you mind if I hold your husband's arm?" And I'm sure I had bruises after that. But so yeah, I'm always watching out, for all the things that can go wrong. We did have a situation landing at Heathrow where obviously we were circling a lot, and I said to Jennifer, "Something is not right." And sure enough, the co-captain came down and was looking over the wing right by us at the flaps. And so, as we found out from our family meeting us, that there were fire engines out there, ambulances waiting to greet us. And so, but I've got so much confidence. Most pilots, their training is incredible. They're rather like the whatever his name was that landed in the Hudson.
Sully.
Mhm.
Sully.
Yeah, Sully. It's a training that takes over. I mean, a couple of times I had to be guided into the international because the cloud level was so low, and normally I shouldn't have done that, but the tower said, "Okay, if you get near enough, we'll guide you in by radar." So you've got to put your total trust in somebody at the control tower who's watching, where you are at your elevation and everything else. So there are times when you have to put your trust in other people and your training. And flying is something you don't, unlike driving, which I think we all have moments when we're not certain what we were doing a few minutes before.
Right.
With flying, you're always looking out for places to potentially land. Like one of the training things is the instructor cuts the engine without warning, and you've got to immediately react. And what are you going to do? You've got to find somewhere to land. You've got to work out what the wind direction is. What the are there any places where you think you could safely get down? And then really, how do you, just like Sully, you've got to bring the plane in and you've got to try and float it above the ground without the engine running. But
Yeah. Wow.
yeah,
Fascinating.
Fascinating for sure. And I'm sure that woman whose shoulder you put your hand on is still talking about that story.
I bet.
You're the star in that story, Barry.
well, I don't know about that. It's just that I know how flying can be frightening for people, and I'm usually keeping an eye on what's going on. Particularly when Alberta, where we've got these incredibly strong winds that come in, and I remember taking Jennifer. Jennifer didn't come many times flying with me because she was actually quite nervous, and I'm trying to assure her landing in a Chinook that it's actually safer because it's relative to the wind speed that your safety is. So the wind could be going at 40 knots. So you're actually only flying over the ground at something like, maybe 20 knots. So you're coming in really slowly, but you are bucking around like a crazy bucking horse. But once you've got used to that kind of condition, then you can, and probably the other thing, I had something like, over the course of learning to training in Britain and training in Canada, I had about probably 20 different instructors. And one of them was a young lady of 17 with a fairly foul mouth. she really put me straight a few times, particularly on crosswind landings. It's one of the more difficult maneuvers because you've got to crank the plane in at an angle to the runway, and then at the last moment you've got to use the rudder to flick it round, and hopefully you're lined up with the runway when you do that. So.
Wow, that's crazy. I admire all of that because I find I'm getting less tolerant of flying as I get older. I get much more nervous now than when I was younger. I didn't even think about it, and it definitely is more. I'm much more nervous than I used to be. So
yeah, well,
I don't know why that is, but I am.
I'm not certain. I mean, in my case, knowing a little bit, it can be dangerous. And but I think part of it, if I'm actually in control, that makes a huge difference. So
Yeah,
I can determine, what's going on, and I think it's like being a passenger sometimes in a car. When I'm doing the actual flying, I feel a lot more comfortable because I know what I'm planning for and what's coming up. So.
Sure.
Maybe it's the fear of the unknown. And then, of course, something like the MAX airliner and the problems with that, where there was no way for a pilot to understand what was going on.
Well, that's right. And maybe, so yeah, maybe there's just more reason to be nervous these days with, you know, with stories like that, for sure. And
The planes have become so sophisticated, like everything that I flew, it was all, the controls were connected by wires to, you know, to the rudder and to the ailerons. So you had a direct reaction. They weren't an electronic connection, which you haven't got any feel. Now, many of them have got the kind of haptic feel built into them, but still it's kind of a very different reaction. I mean, in a small plane, when you pull the stick forward, the plane goes up, you know it's going to go up. And if you push it forward, like a few times when I took friends up, I would, they'd say, oh, can we look at a piece of land? And I'd push the stick forward immediately because the plane's going into a dive. And of course, you can see they were catching their breath. It was maybe not the kindest thing to do.
be careful what you ask for when you're up in a plane.
I've got to say, I would like to go up one last time. So I'm thinking if I could get 4 or 5 seniors who are willing to come to Springbank, I will certainly, you know, join in that exercise and see whether I can still land. I'm pretty confident I can because I'm doing it in virtual reality. I know the basic maneuvers that are required. So.
Well, that's pretty cool. And that invitation is in your video. So if anybody gets in touch with us and wants to reach you, we'll connect them to you.
Okay.
Sounds good. Thank you, Barry, so much for this. That was awesome.